The chandelier light caught the bubbles in my crystal flute, turning the champagne into a flurry of tiny, rising stars. As the premier hostess of Manhattan's elite, I was used to the sparkle. I was Sloane Sterling, the woman whose galas determined who was in and who was forgotten. My husband, Vaughan, stood across the room, his hand resting possessively on the small of my sister Celine's back. I remember thinking how sweet it was, how much he cared for my family. I didn't know then that the sweetness was rot. The gala was winding down when I went to the library to fetch a vintage ledger for a donor. The heavy oak doors were ajar, and the sound of hushed, breathless laughter stopped me cold. "She has no idea, does she?" my sister Celine whispered. I peered through the crack. She was pressed against the mahogany desk, her silk dress rumpled. Vaughan was leaning over her, his face a mask of hunger I had never seen directed at me. "Sloane thinks she's the director of this play," Vaughan said, his voice dripping with a mockery that cut deeper than any blade. "She doesn't realize she's just the bank account. The inheritance is locked up in her name, but the accident will change all of that." "The hit and run?" Celine asked, her eyes wide with a sick sort of excitement. "Tonight," Vaughan replied, checking his platinum watch. "The stolen car is already in place. After the party, I'll make sure she's drugged enough to be drowsy. I'll take her car, hit the target, and leave her fingerprints all over the steering wheel. By the time the police arrive at the house, she'll be passed out in the driver's seat. A high society drunk kills a pedestrian? She'll be buried in legal fees and prison cells. And we'll be the grieving family holding the purse strings." "You're a genius, Vaughan," she said, pulling him into a kiss. I stood in the hallway, the crystal flute slipping from my fingers. It shattered on the marble, the sound echoing like a gunshot. They didn't hear me over their own laughter. I ran. I remember the sirens, the handcuffs, the cold stone of the cell, and finally, the chaotic, terrifying roar of the prison riot where a shiv found my ribs. My last thought was, I gave them everything, and they gave me a grave. I gasped, my lungs burning as if I'd just surfaced from the bottom of the ocean. The smell of cold stone and blood was gone, replaced by the expensive, floral scent of Jo Malone candles and joaillery perfume. I was sitting at my vanity. The light was soft, amber, and perfect. I looked at my reflection. My skin was flawless, no prison pallor in sight. I wore a shimmering Dior gown, and my diamond necklace felt heavy and real against my throat. I looked at the clock on the wall. 11:15 p.m. The date on my phone flashed, November 14th. The night of the gala. The night of the hit and run. "Sloane? Darling, are you coming back out? The mayor is asking for you." Vaughan's voice called from the bedroom door. I froze, my hand clenching the edge of the vanity. My heart was a frantic bird, but I forced my face into a mask of serene elegance, the mask I had worn for 10 years. "Just a moment, Vaughan," I said, my voice steady despite the scream caught in my throat. "I just need to fix my lipstick." He stepped into the room, looking every bit the handsome, devoted husband. He walked up behind me and placed his hands on my shoulders. I felt a visceral wave of revulsion, a memory of those same hands holding my sister in the library. "You look breathtaking tonight," Vaughan said, kissing the top of my head. "But you look a bit tired. Why don't you have a drink of that special tonic the doctor gave you for your nerves?" I left it on the nightstand. The tonic, the drug that would make me drowsy enough to be framed. "I'll have it in a moment," I said, meeting his eyes in the mirror. "Go back out, Vaughan. I'll be right there." As soon as he left, I dumped the liquid into a potted orchid and felt a cold, crystalline clarity settle over me. I wasn't going to prison. I wasn't going to die in a riot. I had been given the one thing New York society never offered, a second chance. I grabbed my shawl and slipped out the service entrance. I didn't go to the library. I went to the one person who hated Vaughan even more than I did now. Kael's penthouse was a fortress of glass and steel overlooking Central Park. As Vaughan's best friend and the city's most ruthless corporate fixer, Kael knew where every body was buried. He was the man you called when you wanted a scandal to vanish or a rival to crumble. He was also the only person who had ever looked at Vaughan with a hidden, silent contempt. I didn't ring the bell. I used the emergency code Vaughan had given me years ago. When the elevator doors opened, Kael was standing there, a glass of neat bourbon in his hand, looking as if he'd been expecting a ghost. "Sloane," Kael said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. He didn't look surprised, he looked intrigued. "You're supposed to be hosting the event of the season. Why are you at my door, looking like you've just seen your own funeral?" "Because I have, Kael," I said, walking past him into the living room. "Vaughan and Celine. They're framing me tonight. A hit and run. My car, his crime, my inheritance." Kael leaned against the window frame, the city lights reflecting in his dark, unreadable eyes. "Vaughan always was a sloppy predator," he said, taking a sip of his drink. "I've been cleaning up his messes for years, Sloane. I've watched him bleed you dry and call it love. I kept waiting for you to see it." "I see it now," I said, stepping closer to him. "I need you to help me fix it. Not for him. For me." Kael set his glass down on a marble coaster. He walked toward me, his presence massive and intimidating, but for the first time, I didn't feel small. He stopped inches from me, the scent of expensive tobacco and rain clinging to him. "I don't work for free, Sloane," Kael said, his gaze dropping to my lips before returning to my eyes. "I have the inheritance, Kael," I replied. "And once Vaughan is gone, I'll have the board seats he's been using to hold you back. You want his shares? They're yours. I just want my life back." Kael reached out, his fingers grazing the line of my jaw. It wasn't the touch of a husband. It was the touch of an ally. "I've wanted to bury that snake for a decade," he said, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. "Let me clean him up for you this time. We're going to swap the cars, Sloane. By the time the sun comes up, he'll be the one wishing he'd never been born." I re-entered the ballroom like a ghost returning to a banquet. To the 300 guests sipping vintage Cristal and laughing under the weight of their own diamonds, I was still Sloane Sterling, the undisputed queen of the New York social circuit. But as I smoothed the silk of my Dior gown, I felt like a soldier donning armor. The air in the room, once filled with the scent of success and expensive lilies, now felt heavy with the stench of a locker room after a hard-fought game, sweaty, desperate, and aggressive. I scanned the crowd until I found her. My sister, Celine, was standing near the towering ice sculpture of a swan, her head tilted back as she laughed at something a senator was saying. She looked radiant in a deep emerald dress that matched the color of her envy. When her eyes met mine, a flicker of something sharp, guilt or perhaps anticipation, crossed her face before she smoothed it into a mask of concerned affection. She hurried toward me, her heels clicking a frantic rhythm on the marble floor.
"Sloane."
"There you are," Celine said, her voice high and brittle. She reached out to take my hand, and for a second, I had to fight the urge to pull away as if she were a venomous snake. Her fingers were ice cold. "You disappeared for nearly an hour. Everyone was asking where the hostess of the year had gone. Are you feeling okay? You look a bit flush." "Just the heat of the ballroom, Celine," I said, squeezing her hand just a little too hard, watching the way her eyes widened. I leaned in, my voice a conspiratorial whisper. "I was just in the library. I had the strangest dizzy spell. I think the stress of the gala is finally catching up to me." "Oh, you poor thing," Celine said, her eyes gleaming with a sick, predatory relief. She thought the tonic Vaughan had given me was finally working its way into my system. She thought I was drifting into the haze they needed me in. "You really should go upstairs and lie down. You've done enough tonight." "I think I might," I replied, forcing a weary smile. "Vaughan mentioned he's taking my SUV tonight to pick up those late-night hors d'oeuvres from the caterer. I told him it was fine. I'm feeling so sleepy, I'll probably just head up to bed and let him handle the closing details." "That's a wonderful idea," Celine said, her voice almost breathless now. She couldn't wait to get me out of the way. "Get some rest, Sloane. You've earned it. I'll make sure everything here stays perfect." "I know you will," I said, looking at the woman who shared my DNA, the woman who had laughed about my death only an hour ago. I was just thinking about how lucky I am to have a sister like you. Someone I can truly trust to take my place. She didn't hear the double meaning. She just beamed, a triumphant glint in her eyes as she turned to find Vaughan. I watched her weave through the crowd, straight to my husband. I saw her lean in, whispering in his ear, her hand lingering on his arm just a second too long for a sister-in-law. Vaughan looked up, his gaze finding mine across the room. He raised his champagne flute in a silent, mocking toast, a salute to the accident he thought was inevitable. I felt a sharp vibration in my clutch. I pulled out my phone, shielding the screen from view. It was a text from Kael. The swap is ready. He's taking the stolen sedan thinking it's your SUV. The plates are switched. The GPS is rigged. He's driving his own coffin. Get clear. A cold, crystalline calm settled over me. I wasn't the lamb anymore. I was the one holding the blade, and the music of the gala sounded like a victory march. I raised my own glass back at Vaughan, the bubbles in the champagne looking like tiny explosions. To family, I whispered to the empty air. May they get exactly what they deserve. The rain began to fall just as the last of the limousines pulled away from the curb, a cold, gray drizzle that turned the manicured gardens of our estate into a blurred landscape of shadows. Inside the foyer, the air was thick with the scent of wilted lilies and the lingering smoke of expensive cigars. I stood at the foot of the grand staircase, one hand gripping the banister as if I were struggling to keep my balance. I leaned my head back, letting my eyelids flutter, playing the part of the drugged, discarded wife to perfection. Vaughan approached me, his tuxedo jacket discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up with a utilitarian efficiency that made my stomach turn. He looked at me not with love, but with the clinical detachment of a man checking a timer on a bomb. You're barely standing, Sloane, he said, reaching out to steady me. His touch was firm, but there was no warmth in it, only the terrifying strength of a man who had already decided I was a ghost. You need to go up to bed. I'll handle the staff and the caterers. I feel so heavy, Vaughan, I said, slurring my words just enough to be convincing. I let my head loll against his shoulder for a second, feeling the steady, remorseless beat of his heart. Everything is vibrating. It's just the exhaustion, darling, he replied, his voice a low, soothing hum that hit a jagged edge. I have to run a quick errand for the caterer, some confusion with the late-night billing. I'm taking your SUV since the sedan is blocked in by the service trucks. I'll be back before you even fall asleep. I watched him through half-closed eyes as he signaled to Celine, who was lingering in the shadows of the dining room. She was already wearing her trench coat, her eyes bright with a feverish, manic energy. She thought she was going on an adventure. She thought she was riding shotgun to her own fortune. Be careful, Vaughan, I whispered, the words tasting like ash. The roads, they're so slick. I'm always careful, Sloane, he said. He leaned in and kissed my forehead, a final, Judas kiss, and then he was gone, stepping out into the rain with Celine trailing at his heels like a loyal hound. I waited until the heavy front doors clicked shut. The moment the lock engaged, I stood up straight. The drowsy haze vanished, replaced by a cold, searing adrenaline that made my fingertips tingle. I didn't go to bed. I walked straight to the library windows and pulled back the heavy velvet curtains just enough to see the driveway. In the dark and the driving rain, the black sedan that Kael's team had delivered looked like a twin to my SUV. It was a masterpiece of misdirection. To a man as arrogant and hurried as Vaughan, the silhouette was identical. He climbed into the driver's seat, and Celine slipped into the passenger side. I watched the taillights flare, red eyes in the darkness, as the car roared to life and slid down the long, winding drive. They're moving, a voice said from the shadows behind me. I didn't flinch. Kael stepped into the light of the library, his dark tactical jacket damp from the rain, a tablet glowing in his hand. He looked like a creature of the night, something built of steel and silence. He took the bait, I said, my voice steady and hard. He took his own car, Sloane, Kael corrected, walking over to stand beside me. He tapped the screen of the tablet, showing a pulsing red, moving toward the industrial district of 4th Street. He thinks he's driving your SUV with stolen plates. He doesn't realize he's driving his own sedan with the stolen plates he provided, registered in his own name, with his own GPS tracking every turn. And he certainly doesn't know about the high-def cameras I hidden in the dash and the rear-view mirror. Will it be enough? I asked, watching the red move closer to the intersection where the accident was supposed to happen. The internal audio is already recording, Kael said. He turned the volume up on the tablet. Through the speakers, I heard the sound of the windshield wipers and the muffled, frantic conversation inside the car. Slow down, Vaughan. Celine's voice crackled through the feed. The intersection is just ahead. Is the target in place? The guy I hired said he'd have the vagrant positioned right at the corner. Vaughan's voice replied, tight with a sick, breathless excitement. One hit, a quick exit, and then we get home and put Sloane's hands on the wheel. By the time the cops trace the SUV, she'll be the one going to the precinct in handcuffs. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Listening to them plot my ruin in real time was like watching a film of my own murder. I looked at Kael, whose jaw was set in a line of pure, lethal focus. I've been cleaning up his messes for a long time, Sloane, Kael said, his eyes never leaving the screen. But I think this is the first time I've actually enjoyed the job. He's almost there, I whispered. Watch, Kael said, his finger hovering over a command on the tablet. This is where the script changes. The silence in the library was absolute, save for the rhythmic clicking of the grandfather clock and the distant, muffled sound of the storm. Kael and I stood shoulder to shoulder, our eyes locked onto the tablet screen. The red on the GPS map hovered over the 4th Street intersection, a desolate patch of industrial asphalt where the streetlights flickered like dying stars. Then the audio feed exploded. Crunch. It was the sound of 1,000 glass shards meeting cold steel. The sedan groaned as the front end buckled, the impact with Kael's weighted mannequin sending a shuddering vibration through the speakers that seemed to rattle my very bones. I closed my eyes for a split second, seeing the prison riot version of my death in the darkness behind my eyelids. But this time, I wasn't the one on the floor. Did we hit him? Vaughan, tell me we hit him. Celine's voice shrieked through the feed, her tone a jagged mix of horror and predatory excitement. I saw the impact, Celine. He went over the hood, Vaughan said, his breathing coming in shallow, ragged gasps. I could hear the frantic clicking of his seatbelt being undone. God, the airbag didn't even go off. This SUV is a tank. Don't just sit there. Drive. Celine screamed. We have to get back. We have to drag Sloane's drunk body into this seat before the witnesses start calling it in. Move, Vaughan. Kael didn't say a word. He simply tapped a command on the tablet, and a split screen appeared. On the left was the GPS, on the right, the high-definition internal cabin feed. The infrared light turned my husband and sister into ghostly, monochromatic monsters. Vaughan threw the car into reverse, the tires screeching against the wet pavement. But the sedan didn't move. The impact had been calculated by Kael to disable the front axle while looking like a routine fender bender. The car, it won't shift. Vaughan yelled, slamming his palm against the dashboard. What is wrong with this thing? Sloane just had it serviced. Vaughan, look at the steering wheel, Celine whispered, her voice suddenly trembling with a new kind of fear. Why is the logo wrong? This isn't the SUV's emblem. What are you talking about? Vaughan snapped. He looked down at the center console, his eyes wide and wild. He reached for the registration in the sun visor, his fingers fumbling with the plastic. He ripped the paper out. Registration? Black sedan. Vaughan Sterling? My name? Why is my name on the papers for the car we stole? Wait, Celine said, her voice dropping to a terrifying realization. Vaughan, if this is your car, and these are your plates, and we just hit a pedestrian. It was a frame. Vaughan roared, his face contorting in the ghostly green light of the dash. She knew. That bitch knew. In the distance, the first faint wail of a siren began to bleed into the audio feed. Kael had timed the anonymous 911 call to perfection. The blue and red lights began to dance off the wet brick walls of the industrial district on the external camera feed. "We have to get out," Celine yelled, clawing at the passenger door handle. "We can run. We can say the car was stolen earlier tonight." She pulled the handle. Nothing happened. She pulled harder, her movements becoming animalistic and panicked. "It's locked. Vaughan, open the doors," she screamed. "I am." "The electronic locks aren't responding," Vaughan yelled back, his voice cracking into a high-pitched wail of pure terror. He pounded his fists against the reinforced glass of the driver's side window. Kael looked at me, a cold, dark satisfaction in his eyes. He raised the tablet. "The child safety locks are a wonderful invention," he said, his voice a low, clinical rumble. "Especially when the central locking system has been overridden by a remote server. They're effectively in a glass-walled cell." We watched as 3 police cruisers swerved into the intersection, their headlights illuminating the wreckage of the sedan and the body, lying in the road. Officers spilled out, guns drawn, shouting commands that were muffled by the sedan's soundproofing. "Please, open the door." Celine's voice was a thin, pathetic sob now. "I've seen enough," I said, my voice sounding like ice. I reached out and tapped the mute button on the tablet. The library returned to its quiet, expensive silence. Kael closed the tablet cover with a sharp snap. He stepped closer to me, his presence a massive, protective weight in the room. "The police will find the drug kit in the glove box, Sloane. The one Vaughan was going to use on you. Except this time, the prints on the vials will be his and hers. And the victim they hit? By the time they get him to the morgue, the police will realize it's a high-tech ballistic mannequin, but the intent to kill is already recorded on my server." I looked at Kael, the man who had been Vaughan's best friend for years, and realized I didn't truly know him at all. But I knew I could trust him, because a man who cleans up messes for a living knows exactly how to make sure the trash stays gone. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now," Kael said, reaching out to tuck a stray hair behind my ear, his fingers warm and steady, "we wait for the phone to ring. And then we start the process of taking back your life." The morning sun hit the marble floors of the foyer with a cold, unforgiving brightness. It was the kind of light that revealed every speck of dust and every hairline fracture in a polished surface. I sat in the breakfast nook, dressed in a crisp white silk robe, sipping black coffee that tasted like victory. The phone rang at 6:15 a.m. "Mrs. Sterling?" a gravelly voice asked. "This is Detective Miller from the 14th Precinct. There's been an incident involving your husband and your sister." "An incident?" I asked, my voice trembling with the perfect amount of practiced concern. I looked across the table at Kael. He was already dressed in a charcoal suit, leaning against the counter as he scrolled through the morning's early digital headlines. He gave me a sharp, approving nod. Are they all right?" "They're in custody, ma'am," Miller said. "There was a hidden run on 4th Street. Your husband was driving a vehicle registered in his name that had been reported as involved in a theft of plates. We also found some controlled substances in the vehicle. We need you to come down." "I'll be there immediately," I said, hanging up. I looked at Kael. "It's starting." "It's already over," Kael said, tossing a tablet onto the table. "Look." The headline of the New York Post was a jagged, screaming thing, sterling silver tarnished, high society mogul arrested in deadly hit and run. Beneath it was a grainy photo of Vaughan, his tuxedo shirt torn, being pushed into the back of a squad car. Beside him, Celine was shielding her face, her emerald dress looking like a swamp in the harsh police floodlights. "The board of Sterling Global is already convening an emergency session," Kael said, his voice a low, resonant hum. "I've sent them a copy of the incident report, along with a little extra flavoring regarding Vaughan's offshore accounts. By noon, he won't even have a parking space at the office, let alone a seat at the table." "And the inheritance?" I asked. "Protected," Kael said. He walked over to me, his presence an overwhelming heat in the cool kitchen. He placed his hands on the back of my chair, leaning down so his face was inches from mine. "Vaughan signed a morals clause in your postnup, Sloane. Criminal charges for attempted murder and drug possession? He's been stripped of every penny. You're not just free, you're the sole owner of the Sterling Empire. We arrived at the precinct an hour later. The media circus was already in full swing, paparazzi swarming the steps like locusts. Kael shielded me as we pushed through, his arm a solid, protective bar across my shoulders. Inside, the air smelled of stale coffee and desperation. I saw them through the reinforced glass of the holding area. Celine was hysterical, her makeup smeared into a grotesque mask, screaming at a public defender. Vaughan was sitting on a metal bench, his head in his hands, looking like a man who had finally realized the floor had dropped out from under him. When Vaughan saw me, he lunged at the glass.
Sloane.
You did this. You set us up. I didn't flinch. I walked right up to the partition, my expression one of calm, elegant disappointment. I didn't do anything, Vaughan. You chose the car. You chose the passenger. And you chose to drive. You bitch, he roared, his voice muffled by the glass. I'll kill you. You already tried that, I said, my voice low enough that only he could hear. But you were always a sloppy predator, Vaughan. And now, you're just a convict. I turned away, catching Celine's eyes. She looked at me with a raw, naked terror. I didn't say a word to her. I didn't have to. The silence was the greatest punishment I could give her. As we walked back to the car, Kael opened the door for me. What's next, Sloane? I looked at the city skyline, the towers gleaming like promises. Next, Kael, we rebuild. And I think I'd like to start by changing the name on the building. Kael smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his dark eyes. I think the Sloane Towers has a nice ring to it. The glass walls of my new penthouse didn't just overlook Central Park. They seemed to hold the entire city in a tight, sparkling embrace. It was a far cry from the stifling, antique-laden halls of the Sterling estate. That house had been a museum dedicated to my own slow suffocation, a place where every gilded frame was a bar in a cage I hadn't even realized I was living in. Here, 40 stories above the noise and the lies, the air felt thin, sharp, and entirely mine. I stood on the balcony, the wind whipping my hair across my face. In my hand was a glass of vintage Bordeaux, the deep red liquid looking like velvet in the twilight. I wasn't hosting a gala tonight. I wasn't monitoring the levels of the hors d'oeuvres or making sure the senator's wife was sufficiently flattered. I was simply breathing. The private elevator chimed behind me. I didn't have to turn around to know who it was. The steady, heavy footfall was a rhythm I had come to rely on over the last few months. The security team said you were out here taking in the smog, Kael said, his voice a low, amused rumble. I turned as he stepped onto the balcony. He had discarded his tie, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, looking less like a corporate fixer and more like a man who had finally put down a heavy burden. He was carrying a single, dark red rose, a stark contrast to the sterile, modern lines of the penthouse. It's not smog tonight, Kael, I said, a small smile tugging at my lips as I took the flower from him. It's clarity. I can see all the way to the bridge. You can see further than that, Sloane, Kael replied, stepping up beside me. He leaned his elbows on the railing, looking out at the grid of lights. Vaughan's sentencing came through an hour ago. 25 years. No possibility of parole until he's nearly 70. Celine got 15. The DA wasn't in a mood to be lenient after the audio of her laughing about your accident went viral. I felt a ghost of a shiver pass through me, but it wasn't fear. It was the final, clicking lock of a door closing forever. 25 years, I whispered. He wanted to bury me in a cell for a lifetime. I suppose it's only poetic that he found the grave he dug for me. He was always a small man, Sloane, Kael said, turning to look at me. His dark eyes were intense, searching my face with a raw honesty that Vaughan had never possessed. He just had a big name. Now, that name belongs to you. The board officially rebranded the firm this afternoon. The Vance Group. Your maiden name looks good on the marquee. Vance, I said, testing the weight of it. It felt light. It felt like home. Thank you, Kael. For everything. For the cars, the cameras, for seeing me when I was invisible. I never saw you as invisible, Sloane, Kael said, his voice dropping to a low, seductive register. He reached out, his hand covering mine on the railing. His skin was warm, his grip firm and grounding. I saw a woman who was playing a part because she thought she had to. I just waited for the actress to quit, so I could meet the lead. I looked at him, the man who had been the fixer for the man who tried to kill me. The irony wasn't lost on me, but the heat between us was undeniable. It was a slow-burning fire that had been forged in the crucible of betrayal and survival. I'm not a mess to be fixed anymore, Kael, I said, stepping closer to him, the scent of his cologne, rain and expensive tobacco, filling my senses. I know, Kael whispered, his hand moving from my wrist to the small of my back, pulling me into the hard, steady heat of his chest. That's why I'm still here. I'm not interested in the fix. I'm interested in the woman who survived it. He leaned down, his lips hovering just inches from mine. You've spent your life being a hostess for everyone else's happiness, Sloane. What do you want for yourself? I reached up, my fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of his neck, pulling him that final, electric inch closer. I want everything I was told I couldn't have, I replied. I want power. I want peace. And I think I want you. He kissed me then, a deep, triumphant embrace that tasted of salt, steel, and a future I had fought a war to claim. As the city lights twinkled below us, I knew the socialite was dead and buried. The woman standing on this balcony was an architect, and I was just getting started on the blueprints of my new world.